just, in that case, lead off by presenting both the speaker and the seminar series. The seminar series is called History of the Present. And I've been running this at SAIS Europe since 2017, 2018. And the idea is to look at the historical roots of contemporary developments. It's about learning how history can help us understand contemporary developments. And it's also a kind of first draft of history, trying to work out the historical significance of historical developments. So ever since 2017, I've been looking for developments, for events that seem to have a clear historical significance. Now, today's subject, Finland, NATO, and the lessons of history, absolutely fit in with this. It's obviously connected to the ongoing challenge presented by Russia to Europe in the wake of the Putin's attack on the Ukraine. And one of the consequences for Europe, a diplomatic consequence for Europe, has been that Finland and Sweden applied to join NATO in May, and in July, NATO agreed the accession protocol of the two countries. Now, you know, this is a really big deal in Europe because of history, and in particular, perhaps in the case of Finland. Finland, as many of you probably know, has a 1,300-kilometer border with Russia. It was kept under a watchful Soviet eyes during the Cold War, not least because of the 1939-40 Winter War between Finland and the Soviet Union. So we've got a lot of history there. We've got a major development, a major diplomatic development, and it really does seem to fit into the category of developments of historical events that the series is intended to deal with. And we couldn't really wish for anybody better to talk about this. Pertti Ahonen is one of the leading post-1945 historians of Europe, one of the leading people in my own field. He has a PhD from Yale University. He taught in Britain at Sheffield University and Edinburgh University before returning to Finland at the University of Jyväskylä in 2014. His books, he's written a number of very well-known books, perhaps the most famous being his study of death at the Berlin Wall, which is published by Oxford University Press in 2011, which was a history of the many people who were killed and the escapes from East Germany to West Germany. Now, the last time we saw each other and agreed that Pertti should come to Bologna was over a beer in bright sunlight at 2 a.m. in June 2017. In Finland, in Jyväskylä. I've been wanting to invite him to Bologna for a long time. I can only thank him for coming and regret I'm not here myself. So Pertti, welcome to Bologna. I'm going to pass you over to Professor Finkel, who will be moderator and host. We're all looking forward to your presentation very much.
Thank you, Mark. And let's start. So how we'll do it, Professor Ahonen will talk for about 30-35 minutes, right? And then we will open up for the Q&A. So the floor is yours.
Right. Thanks very much indeed. Thanks so much for the invitation to come here and talk to you today. Thanks so much for that really generous introduction, Mark. And I can only hope that your COVID gets much, much better very soon. It's a nasty virus, as we all know. So it's really an honor to be here in this impressive seminar series that's been running for some time. And of course, the title of the series itself immediately brings to my mind anyway, the classic study by Timothy Gardner-Nash, where he goes through a lot of the key events of the 1990s in Europe. That book is based in large part on his personal observations from being present at many of the places where big things were happening in Eastern Europe. Great book. I can't offer you that kind of participant perspective on ongoing major events. I'm more of a regular Joe historian who just studies things from a bit of a distance. But I will try to offer today observations about one important ongoing political process, as you already heard, and its links to history. Or more specifically, I'm going to talk about the lessons from history that policymakers involved in that process have been using. And the process is Finland and Sweden's attempt to join NATO, which reached a decisive moment here, back on the 18th of May of this year, when Finland, along with Sweden, left its application to NATO membership to NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg in Brussels. And Stoltenberg, of course, is a Norwegian, so it was a bit of a Nordic reunion of sorts. Now, that was a very dramatic moment for both states, a major policy reversal. Sweden, of course, has a tradition of neutrality stretching back for a couple of 100 years, has stayed out of alliances and also all major armed conflicts ever since the Napoleonic Wars. Finland has been a bit less lucky historically. Following independence from Russia in 1917, it of course was heavily involved in World War II, fighting the Soviet Union first in 39 to 40 and then again from 41 to 44. But then after the war, Finland also has pursued a neutral status. It did so in the Cold War, and the same policy line was maintained after the Cold War as well, until now. And until very recently, indeed, both Finland and Sweden had repeatedly rejected NATO membership for them. Even at the beginning of this year, both governments stated quite clearly that a NATO membership was not on the agenda for them. But then, of course, many things changed suddenly on the 24th of February of this year with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. A quick reevaluation of the political realities ensued in many places, including Finland, where on the same day, President Sauli Niinistö, who is the man standing here on the right, stated, standing there with the Prime Minister Sanna Marin, who's also got some international prominence recently. What Niinistö stated on that day is kind of well known in Finland now. And he went, "Now the masks have been taken off and only the cold visage of war remains." However, even so, still on the 24th of February, the president and other key leaders in Finland also stated that Finland was still not considering a NATO membership at that point. However, that view then changed very soon. There followed a rapid political process where the government, parliament, both reassessed the situation, prepared analysis and reports, and came out in favor of the NATO membership for Finland. And then on the 12th of May, both the president and the prime minister jointly announced their support for Finland's membership, and that then paved the way for the delivery of the membership application to Brussels about a week later. So again, what we have here is really quite a remarkable fundamental reorientation in two stable democratic countries' foreign and defense policies within less than 3 months. The shift to a new position, which for years, indeed decades or centuries in the case of Sweden, had been declared undesirable. And there's certainly many aspects of these events that could be explored. The NATO side, for instance, the Swedish perspective on this, the diplomatic maneuvering, including what exactly Turkey may be up to these days. But today, I'm going to confine myself to the Finnish case and one particular angle, namely uses and lessons of history. So I'm trying to explore these kinds of themes. What can this case tell us about the uses of history, and particularly lessons drawn from history, in decision-making about foreign and defense policy? How have Finnish leaders specifically applied lessons from history in defining and justifying their country's international position, particularly its position vis-a-vis NATO? What have those history lessons been, and what effects have these lessons had? Have they constituted an asset or perhaps an obstacle? And more widely, what can this case perhaps contribute to the wider literature about the uses and abuses of history and its lessons, especially in foreign policy decision-making? What I'm presenting is very much work in progress in fairly early stages still, but I will offer observations, some tentative findings, nothing very definitive yet. And I also hope to raise questions that we can then perhaps discuss together at the end. I'd certainly be very grateful for your reactions and thoughts. So let's get going with the kinds of lessons from history that Finnish policymakers have used vis-a-vis NATO. What lessons have been drawn and how have they been applied? Well, the source for most of these lessons is the Second World War and its impact, which is not really unique nor surprising. The Second World War is, after all, in many ways, the most significant site of memory in post-45 Europe, has been and in many ways still is. But its absolute centrality is still worth stressing in the Finnish case. And here I have a quotation from two prominent Finnish scholars who studied Finnish memory cultures in the 20th century, who've come to the conclusion that the memory of the war is held up as the most important collective experience of the nation. The war was in many ways a traumatic experience for Finland. The country was defeated twice, first in a limited way in the David versus Goliath setting of the Winter War of 1939 to 1940, when Finland resisted and largely stalled the Soviet invasion, fighting pretty much on its own, receiving sympathy, but not much else from the outside world. And then again, the country was defeated much more comprehensively in the so-called continuation war from 41 to 44, which Finland had joined as an ally of Germany and a participant in the aggression of Operation Barbarossa. With the outcome that in the autumn of 44, Finland had to capitulate and sign an armistice with the USSR. After the war, from 1945, Finland then underwent a major foreign policy reorientation, as I already alluded. Given the outcome of the war, the earlier hostile stance towards the USSR had to end, and three key lessons were drawn from recent history at that point. First, as a small state in a vulnerable geopolitical position, I'll just show you this map, which shows the alliance structure from the Cold War, so not from 45, but a few years later. But even looking at this, you can see that Finland's position is a little bit exposed. But as I was saying, Finland, at the end of the war, realized that the prevailing realities had to be recognized. Basically, what that meant, given what had happened in the Second World War, was that Finland would have to stand on its own. The West would not come to its help vis-a-vis the Soviets. And any kind of hubris, including careless pacts with big powers, would almost certainly spell disaster. Second, leading on from that, Finland had to respect the neighboring Soviet superpower and its interests. It was necessary to reach an enduring kind of accommodation with the USSR that could create stable basis for interaction with the Soviets. And third, despite all these challenges, the country had to preserve its independence, sovereignty, and democracy. In many ways, the most fundamental of all of these goals, of course, and avoid becoming a mere Soviet satellite, which is a very real threat after the war. And from these lessons then, or these premises, concrete policies followed, policies that in their essence endured throughout the Cold War. The key priority and an existential issue really was to stay out of any armed conflicts and to try to ensure that such conflicts would not flare up anywhere nearby. And to pursue that aim, it was essential to develop and maintain correct relations with a Soviet superpower and to avoid provocations that might trigger a Soviet invasion or other kind of intervention. And finally, above all, this came to play much more strongly during the later stages of the Cold War after the first few years of relative instability. But Finland aimed to develop and maintain a neutral stance and avoid trying to get drawn into either of the Cold War blocs. So that was the basic orientation. And it was closely linked with two particular individuals and their leadership. And these were the first two presidents of post-war Finland. Juho Paasikivi on the left, who was president from 46 to 56, and then Urho Kekkonen, who held the presidency for no less than 26 years from 1956 to 1982. And the policy, basic policy orientation was really usually referred to as the Paasikivi-Kekkonen line, so named after these two individuals. But the policy also was fundamentally rooted in one key document, and that was the Finno-Soviet Treaty of 1948, or more formally, Agreement of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance. Finland was obliged to resist any attack by, quote, Germany or its allies, as the treaty stated, against Finland or through Finland against the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union could assist if necessary, but that was subject to a Finnish request and further negotiations. All of that obviously was strongly in the Soviet interest. But the treaty was not entirely one way, however. It also recognized Finland's desire to stay out of great power conflicts. And so it provided assurances and a key tool of influence for the Soviet Union, but also a basis for Finland's attempts at neutrality in the Cold War setting. And given this agreement, which was consistently portrayed in Helsinki as a cornerstone of Finland's Cold War foreign policy, any Finnish role in NATO during the Cold War was, of course, absolutely out of the question. It would have provided precisely the kind of provocation that the USSR could have used to provide quote unquote assistance, which the Finnish government certainly did not wish to receive from that direction. So during the Cold War years, particularly under Kekkonen's very long reign, there was a certain kind of policy liturgy that developed in Finland that we kept hearing in public over and over again. Liturgy that stressed Finland's friendly relations with the Soviets, reiterated that Finland would not pose any threat to the USSR, and ruled out an association with NATO as an absolute no-no. Instead, Finland vowed to stay neutral and to avoid any political or military alliance. And this stance, which was really at the core of this Paasikivi-Kekkonen foreign policy line, was a constant feature of public discussion and a tenet that was hammered deep into the psyche of any Finn who lived through the Cold War years, including myself. As someone born in the late 60s, I kept hearing about this line throughout my childhood and youth, I guess you could say. Now, all of this worked reasonably well, certainly in retrospect. It kept Finland out of the Soviet bloc, maintained peace and growing prosperity in the country, and helped to maintain a functioning democratic system. However, the setup was not without its downsides. The emphasis on maintaining good relations and not upsetting the Kremlin came to have strong and questionable personified aspects, particularly during Kekkonen's long presidency. In the 60s and 70s, Kekkonen repeatedly played the Soviet card to portray himself as an irreplaceable leader, as the only person who could guarantee good, stable relations with Moscow. Here he's appearing at a Christmas party of political elites, and the slogan in the background says, "Trust across borders." Bit of a personality cult element evident in that, I think. With this kind of portrayal of himself, Kekkonen sometimes subverted political processes at home, for instance, by having his tenure as president extended with emergency legislation without normal scheduled elections in 1974. The elections simply didn't take place, but Kekkonen received a further term through a parliamentary vote. Kekkonen also typically portrayed himself as a Soviet expert extraordinaire, someone who had the ear of the Kremlin, had vodka drinks with them regularly, and understood the Soviets better than just about any other leader. That was certainly his portrayal of himself. In light of all this, then, unsurprisingly, by the 1970s, Finnish policies drew growing criticism from the West, in part through the concept of Finlandization. The idea was that Finland's supposed neutrality was really quite one-sided and leaned strongly eastwards, and really served to cloak a situation in which the country was in fact controlled remotely from the Soviet Union. Here, Walter Lacour, for instance, the rather conservative commentator and historian, wrote about this in the late 70s, defining Finlandization as the process or state of affairs in which, under the cloak of maintaining friendly relations with the Soviet Union, the sovereignty of a country becomes reduced. And that was a scenario which some saw as a dangerous precedent, not just for Finland, but for much of Western Europe as well, more broadly in the age of détente. And John Floyantis, for instance, one of the kind of political scientist who's written about this came up with the term silk glove hegemony for how this worked, this kind of remote control with tender means, but underlying strong political intent. So that was the setting in Finland during the Cold War. There were certain lessons strongly rooted in the Second World War that were applied to guide the country's post-1945 policies towards East and West, in an equation where any NATO option for Finland was out of the question. Now, after the Cold War, a lot changed, of course. In the transformed geopolitical setting, Finland began to define itself as an unambiguously Western country now. And the resulting reorientation showed probably most clearly in EU membership in 2005. It was another step that had not been considered possible during the Cold War. At the same time, however, the Finnish leadership continued to emphasize the importance of good relations with Russia and continued to act with very considerable caution vis-a-vis the Kremlin, particularly in anything having to do with defense policy. In a major change from the Cold War era, however, the question of Finland's possible NATO membership came up periodically in Finland's political debates from around the turn of the millennium when, of course, NATO's enlargement process really got going. But the discussions were sporadic and superficial, typically, and open advocacy of a Finnish membership remained rare. Typically, key politicians would either rule out a Finnish NATO membership or vaguely state that perhaps a membership could be considered at some point in the future, but not now and not under their own leadership. So neutrality, or at least non-alignment, remained the lodestone of Finnish defense policy, even as economically and also politically, the country was now firmly tied to the EU and the West, especially from 2005 onwards. Now, the main problem that I see here was not that Finland didn't apply to join NATO earlier than this year. Arguably, that may have been the right way to go. We can talk about this. But the problem was rather the repeated and deliberate avoidance of an open debate about a possible NATO option. In a liberal democracy, such an exchange of views should be possible, and I think it's really necessary, especially about a fundamentally important national security issue in a shifting geopolitical context. In many ways, though, this was not the case in post-Cold War Finland, and the roots of that problem, it seems to me, lie in the tabooization or even a kind of demonization of NATO in the earlier Cold War setting, and in the shadows which that tabooization has continued to cast. Linked to this, another problematic continuity from the Cold War in Finland has been the tendency of some of the country's political leaders, particularly the presidents, who constitutionally have quite a big foreign policy role in Finland, to act as if they have a special ability to understand the Russian leaders and their intentions, much in the way that Kekkonen did during the Cold War. For instance, Tarja Halonen, who was president for 2 terms from 2000 to 2012, was repeatedly quite dismissive about the concerns about the direction of Putin's Russia that the Baltic states kept expressing. She would typically reject those kinds of concerns as overdrawn phobias arising from the Soviet era and imply that she and the Finns in general had a more rational view. Also, the current president, Sauli Niinistö, who's been in office since 2012, for a long time seemed rather over-optimistic about his regular contacts and so-called telephone diplomacy with Putin, to a point where CNN's Christian Amanpour called him the Putin whisperer in July of last year, although in a positive sense, someone who could talk to Putin. Sadly, though, whatever Niinistö may have been whispering, Putin obviously did not listen, because I think we can safely assume that Niinistö was not telling him to invade Ukraine. That's pretty much a given. So the broad point that I want to make here is that although quite a lot changed in Finnish foreign policy after the early 1990s, there were also some unfortunate continuities from the Cold War, including quite prominently, especially in the last few years, an unwillingness to subject Putin's Kremlin to a sufficiently hard-headed and critical analysis. The assumption seemed to be that beneath all the annoying macho bluster, Putin was ultimately much like the last few leaders of the Soviet Union, i.e., responsible leader of a major great power with a sort of broad view of things, a man that you could negotiate with, who would not take rash and highly risky actions, at least not in Europe. Another key continuity, as I've already mentioned, was the unwillingness to undergo a thorough open discussion of the NATO option in the country's defense policy field. Neglect that, as I've argued, was strongly rooted in Cold War policies, which in turn reflected historical lessons drawn from the Second World War and its outcome. And in the absence of such a debate, the sudden shift of the spring of this year from a rejection of a NATO membership to a sudden and forceful embrace of it was quite jarring and disorienting. And it too was characterized by a lack of wider analysis and debate. Amounted to a hasty political reversal driven by external events. Historical reference points were rather lacking in this spring's discussion in Finland. Presumed lessons from history remained largely absent, and this has contributed to a wider sense of crisis and uncertainty in the country. And so in Finland's NATO application process, I would argue, history and its lessons supplied in foreign and defense policy during the previous decades have constituted something of an obstacle to productive policy deliberation and formulation. And a bit of water at this point. Mouth get dry from all this talking. The formulaic liturgies and the lack of a public discussion or weighing of alternatives did have useful functions during the Cold War for a country in Finland's vulnerable position. But this approach to the NATO option largely continued even after the Cold War in a transformed geopolitical setting in which a different, more open and deliberative approach would have been needed, in my view. So here I want to refer to a classic study of the uses of history in decision-making by Richard Neustadt and Ernest May, two big-time Harvard professors in their time, one in political science, the other in history. It was a book based on a course they taught for many years at Harvard in the Kennedy School for decision makers, looking at different historical case studies and trying to see what kind of lessons could be drawn from them, had been drawn from them, and whether they had been good or not in a way. Unsurprisingly, they argue that history and an awareness of history is, for the most part, necessary and very useful, and I would agree. But they also point to cases where seeing the past can be an enemy of vision. This is the case, they argued, when policymakers drew on their own vicarious experience, seized on the aspect most comforting to them, and took it to prove truths. And the case of Finland's NATO application this spring, I think, illustrates some of these broader points and highlights some of the limits of the uses of history, of the uses of history lessons in policymaking. However, having said that, I'd like to finish my presentation by complicating the picture a little bit. We historians always like to make things complicated, don't we? So far, I've been analyzing policy guidelines, statements, proclamations, treaties, things that have mostly been in the public domain, and a certain picture has, I think, emerged from there. However, if we look more behind the scenes, and focus on practical steps in Finnish defense policy after the Cold War, steps that have often been taken quietly without any kind of great fanfare or publicity, then the picture looks somewhat different. Instead of a stubborn inflexibility, we can see signs of a quiet, gradual adaptation and shift closer to NATO that has been going on for about 3 decades. Let me just list a few key steps. In 1994, Finland joined NATO's Partnership for Peace program and began consistently to improve its armed forces' technical and operational compatibility with NATO forces. It also signed up to enhanced military cooperation through the Nordic Council, which is a body that brings together Finland and the Scandinavian countries, as it's existed in different forms since the 50s. A key step here was the creation of the Nordic Battle Group in 2008, which is an integrated rapid response military unit. Small, pretty insignificant unit in itself, but taking that step served partly as a backdoor to closer military links with NATO, given that 3 of the Nordic Council's members, and then Denmark, Norway, and Iceland are, of course, long-standing members of North Atlantic Alliance. Then, after Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, the practical cooperation and coordination with NATO intensified. In the summer of 2014, Finland became one of the 5 countries taken into NATO's new Enhanced Opportunities Partnership Program. One of the others was Sweden, by the way. And this program, according to rather vague official statements, offers enhanced opportunities for partnership, dialogue, and cooperation, which you can probably predict by the name already. Also in 2014, the Commander-in-Chief of the Finnish Armed Forces signed a host nation memorandum of understanding with NATO forces. Much of the precise content was kept and still is secret, but in general, Finland agreed to provide civil and military assistance for NATO missions on Finnish soil in both war and peace. And since then, the practical military coordination and cooperation between Finland and NATO has advanced a good deal further through joint training, exercises, and other means. And by the spring of 22, such cooperation and alignment was in fact pretty far advanced on a sort of practical level. Now, this mostly quiet, practical work behind the scenes was bringing Finland towards an ever closer relationship with NATO for years now, even as political leaders remained cautious and wary about Finland's membership, particularly in public, as I've tried to demonstrate, but not only in public. Critics have argued that these steps behind the scenes have been overly clandestine, even sneaky, and that they have gone against the ideals of a transparent Nordic parliamentary democracy. And they probably do have a point on one level about that. However, I'd like to mention an alternative way of looking at these practical steps in defense policy that 2 of my Finnish colleagues, Matti Roito and Antero Holmila, have recently put forward in a book chapter in which they draw on Zygmunt Bauman's theories and apply them to a different setting. They coined the term liquid neutrality. According to them, the gradual alignment with NATO that Finland and Sweden, they analyze both in this article, that Finland and Sweden have been pursuing away from the big limelight can be seen positively as liquid neutrality, which they define as an active, participatory, daring, and deliberate policy orientation that is able to pass around obstacles. Thus, the liquidity kind of moves like water or whatever. And they further write, the alignment with NATO can be seen as the pragmatic approach of enhancing security capability and negotiating more room to maneuver. Moreover, it is security and foreign policy in its own right, signaling that the 2 states are not passive pawns of great power politics. Instead, they are active, proactive, and subjects on their own merit, acting according to their own national interests. The most important of these interests is securing sovereignty and national survival by the means available and necessary. Therefore, the NATO policy of the 2 states continues past policies in new surroundings with other means. And this is from 2021, so about a year ago. So here we have a complication to an overly one-dimensional view of the lessons of history as an obstacle in post-Cold War Finland's attempts to redefine its relationship with NATO. Even as things remained rather blocked on the political level, practical adjustments were taking place on the military plane. And one can certainly argue that these adjustments demonstrated something of an ability to adapt and learn. And there's also one further complicating factor that I want to mention briefly, and that is public opinion. Opinion polls have shown that support in Finland for the prospect of joining NATO has been consistently low and a rejection of that option correspondingly high until Russia's invasion of Ukraine this spring. If you look at it here, it's a consistent set of polling that has been run since 1998 by a Finnish, essentially business group, which can be seen, if anything, as rather pro-NATO. But at the late of the 80s, we had end of the 80s, there was a temporary high of almost 30% support, but since then it's been in the sort of low to mid 20s, even under 20% at one point, until this spring when suddenly from 26% of support for Finland joining, 26% last year, it jumped to 60% in the spring of this year. So really a very dramatic shift in public opinion, clearly in reaction to the war in Ukraine and the kind of shock waves emanating from there. And also obviously a shift that occurred simultaneously and in tandem with a rapid change in the stances of the country's political elite, a shift that clearly came in response to shocking external events rather than to any kind of extended internal deliberations. And here you could argue that any long-standing lessons of history simply fell by the wayside and lost a lot of their relevance in the rush of unanticipated events this year. And indeed, in many ways, it was unclear who was leading whom this spring as Finland raced towards NATO membership application. To what degree were political leaders being reactive, going along with public opinion? To what degree were they leading by shaping public opinion, at least partly? None of that was or is very clear. It was just a kind of shift in parallel that needs more analysis, certainly. But now my time's running out, and I'm just going to conclude with a couple of broad questions, which are as much questions for myself, thoughts that I'm kind of trying to cope with or find answers to, as they are questions for you, although they are also questions for you, and I would appreciate comments and thoughts. The main question has to do with the overall role of history lessons in the development of Finland's NATO policies. As I've tried to show on the political and public level, continuities arising from what had been presented as policy precepts based on lessons of history seem to hinder constructive defense policy deliberation in post-Cold War Finland. However, at the same time, adjustments were taking place behind the scenes on more practical military technical levels. And in the spring of 22, with very rapid and dramatic changes in public opinion, history lessons seemed ultimately somewhat irrelevant when policies were being reoriented quite quickly. So how to evaluate the overall role of the lessons of history in all of this? How much did they matter in the end at different phases of the process? For instance, what role, if any, did history lessons play in the decision-making at the practical military level behind the scenes that I've also described, as opposed to the more public and political level? At this point, it's hard to say, with reduced very little reliable source material available, but it's certainly important to try to explore that aspect as well. And then extrapolating a little bit further from the Finnish case, I have another set of questions that I'm wondering about, which have to do with how much of a role do historical lessons and analogies play in foreign policy decision-making in general? How have they been used in different settings? In what ways could and should these lessons be used? If I go back to Nystad and May's book, for instance. How could the Finnish case be linked to these kinds of wider explorations of these processes, perhaps through larger comparative projects or something like that? That's something that I've been thinking about. And I'll just leave you there with these questions in lieu of a more argumentative conclusion, and also refer to a few studies. There's a handful, first of all, that deal with the uses of history in political decision-making, mostly in the context of American foreign policy. There's Nystad and May, their book that I already mentioned. Then book edited by Lloyd Gardner and Marilyn Young, as well as the article by Jeffrey Record, which have to do largely with the Iraq War, particularly the Second War, and how history was used to justify it in different ways. And an older study, Analogies at War, which is a bit of a classic about how analogies drawing on the Munich Conference of '38 were used in American policymaking in Korea, but particularly in Vietnam. And there's also the two Finnish studies that I've cited, the liquid neutrality article, as well as the contribution on the memory culture of the wars that I referred to earlier. So now I'll just say thank you and stop there and look forward to engaging you with questions and comments and so on. Thank you. Grazie.
Thank you. So let's open this up for the Q&A. If you have any questions or comments, then please raise your hand. Mark, you are behind me, so I don't see you, but if you do have something to say, I'm sure you do, then jump in.
No, I always have something to say, as you know, but I'll let people in the audience ask first.
Thank you. So, anyone? Yes, please.
Hey there, my name is Nick. I'm from the US. I'm curious, going back to when the decades in Finland when potential NATO membership or allying with the West militarily was not discussed, what would the arguments have been, and what would the response be to what actually was the case, which was we can't discuss these matters because we don't want to risk provocation with the Soviets? What would the response have been for those trying to make that, have a discussion at least, if not to change position, if at all?
Yeah. Thank you, Nick. Well, during the Cold War, this really was a topic that you could not seriously discuss in Finland. There wasn't really anyone who argued that Finland should join NATO. There were people within the country who were critical of Kekkonen, who were critical of some of his policies, thought that he was leaning too far towards the Soviet Union in his actions, and that Finland was drifting in a dangerous direction. But this really goes back to this whole notion of Finlandization, which is something that I'm actually quite interested in and have a kind of longer standing interest. I'm trying to work with a colleague on a project relating to this. The space for political debate about foreign policy options was really quite severely reduced in Finland, particularly when you come to the 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s. And that was largely the result of Kekkonen's reign. If you were too critical, particularly of the relationship with the Soviet Union, Kekkonen and his allies, who were in a very powerful position in the country, would portray you as a kind of dangerous right-winger who was undermining national security and causing serious danger to everyone in the country. It wasn't that you'd get locked up or anything like that, but there was a kind of, I suppose, a sort of culture of self-censorship ultimately. And the few people who were more open in criticizing the situation at the time, a couple of them left the country to move somewhere else. Most kind of just moderate their tone, or were largely marginalized politically. Because also the Kekkonen's policy was very popular with the voters. I mean, it was just in the 70s, Finland, friendly relations with the Soviet Union. It's just kind of given that had to be the sort of centerpiece of foreign policy. I'm not sure if that really answers what you were asking about. Then of course there's a change when the Soviet Union collapses, and in the 1990s the discussion culture changes quite drastically, of course, but still a lot of the same politicians who had been in power in the 70s and 80s are still around and still in power. So that also reduces their kind of willingness to criticize themselves, if you will.
Hello, my name is Antonia Maioni. I'm a political scientist from McGill University in Canada. So I want to come back to this concept of liquid neutrality that you raised. Mm-hmm. It's not clear to me in the post-war, maybe you can just sort of dig a little deeper on this for us. Is the liquid neutrality something that is, it's kind of, it doesn't really make for a really kind of nice metaphor. Everything's sort of liquid and mm-hmm. happening. Is it something that means that what happened in terms of some of the things that you mentioned in foreign policy just happened? Or was there a purposefulness in terms of the way these measures were taken? You list them out one after another. So in other words, was it a purpose-driven liquid neutrality, or was it simply opportunistic, or in terms of the critiques of history, vicarious mm-hmm. in that sense?
Yeah, thank you, Tonia. Very good question. I wish my colleagues were here to explain their own contribution, but they're not. So I'll try to do it for them. Yeah, I mean, my view of it, and I think this is the case they try to make, is that it's not just accidental, although there may be some elements of that, or kind of seizing opportunities as they arise, but being flexible in that way. So I guess I think they do present it as a purposeful process, one that seeks ways in which these national interests of maintaining the democratic system, maintaining national security, these kinds of things that have always been there, that in this setting, you're trying to actively promote them with somewhat different means, and it's happening behind the scenes largely. It's not happening in terms of sending a NATO membership application or taking that kind of attack, but it happens more quietly and practically in going into these arrangements that give you opportunities for closer cooperation and so on in a kind of different or shifting political and military situation. That's how I'd read it. And of course, it draws on Zygmunt Bauman's liquid modernity, which is another complex theory that I'm not really sure I understand, but it's like a lot of Bauman stuff. It's brilliant, but it's kind of hard to get your head around it. I don't know if that answers your, yeah.
Following on to that question, thank you. Where would you think the source of that decision is in the institutions? Is it from the executive that's quite powerful in Finland? Is it from the legislative committees? Is it from the military itself and military to military connections? What has been the source of these increasing levels of Nordic cooperation? Is it EU policy sort of downloading to the Finnish foreign ministry? What part of the Finnish institutions are the ones driving these connections?
Right. Yeah. Excellent question. I mean, the liquid neutrality argument about this kind of practical adaptation behind the scenes, particularly in military and technical matters, does raise the question of who's in charge of this. And in that article, they don't get that in depth into that, but their kind of general argument is that there must be wider political backing for this. Otherwise, it would obviously be rather troubling if the military started to run its own policy. That we've seen where that leads in Latin American countries, for instance, and so on. And that would not be something that you want to emulate. So, but there certainly have been differences of opinion among the different elites. The military has historically been more interested in this kind of thing, leaning more towards NATO and the West and military cooperation there. Among the political leaders, there have been differences. I mentioned, for instance, President Tarja Halonen, who was president from 2000 to 2012, was known as particularly NATO critical, with a kind of strong left socialist background in the peace movement of the 60s and 70s, which still, I think, to some degree, is visible in her stances, or was visible in her stances, and some of the other political leaders took a different position on that. But I mean, the military cooperation has to have had political backing. It's never been denounced as some kind of military solo acts. So in that sense, but the precise dynamics are actually difficult to trace because, but as a historian, I kind of want to. I know that not everything is in the archive, and I'm not some sort of naive empiricist that you can just go and here's the document and that's how it was. But these are matters that have deliberately been, the elites have been sort of quiet about the dynamics of this, and so it's going to take a little bit of time to kind of get to the bottom of it. Yeah, I think parliamentary debate works on a certain level, but not everything is discussed in Parliament at the time that it's happening, at least not in the sort of open sessions. Then there are these different committees that have more access to classified materials where things do come up. So yes, I think the executive is more the driving force in this. And you also asked about Nordic cooperation. And that's a good question, because Nordic cooperation has kind of different levels to it. On one hand, or on one level, it's been seen as an alternative to NATO, or was seen, not really anymore now. But the idea was in the early 2000s, for instance, that you could, and that was partly the story behind the Nordic Council moves and the rapid response battalion, that perhaps closer Nordic cooperation could be an alternative. It could be a way for Finland and Sweden outside of NATO working together with the neighboring countries when there's anyway very close cultural and political and economic relations. And this actually goes back to the interwar years as well, when it was talked about, but it never worked. But at the same time, of course, there's the EU level, and now with Finland and Sweden both applying to join NATO, that's not really it's not really a sort of alternative vision anymore, but has become part of that kind of bigger picture. So depending on who you talk to, I think they would have given different answers about what the purpose of that cooperation was.
Thank you. Professor Ahonen.
Yes, thank you. Queen Stephen Muller, professor at Bologna, and from Germany, which is a little bit the basis of my question. I wonder whether there's not another lesson. It's not just history, and that is a lesson about the dynamics of liberal democracies and the political culture concerning authoritarian regimes, which is most of the time over-optimistic. You have this debate very much, especially if it coincides with economic interests. Germany, the case of Russia, China, you might name Saudi Arabia, you might even name Turkey. So I wonder whether that makes it easier for elites to continue. In the case of the Merkel-Steinmeier government, or president right now, he also thought he had a special relationship with his Russian foreign minister. Which suddenly realized if he stops him no way. So I wonder whether there's not a more systematic problem for liberal democracies with authoritarian regimes if they know to play the game in a nice way, which Putin was quite clever to do for quite a while, and it worked quite well in Germany, obviously, and assume in Finland. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. That's definitely true. That it's part of a wider pattern. Absolutely, yeah. There are probably other people in this room better placed to comment on this from a kind of systemic level, because I haven't really thought about that very deeply yet. But you're right. I mean, this is definitely not. I mean, every case is unique in some ways, but the sort of general pattern is there, and certainly look at Gerhard Schröder, what he was to, right. And that's something I need to think about more and read about that. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you. Peter Lewis, I'm faculty here at SAIS and in Washington. The political dimensions that you've outlined have been very clear, and it's been a very helpful conversation. Some of the more recent military dimensions you also alluded to. And I'm just curious as to what kinds of quiet discussions might have been going on at this time about the idea of deterrence. So we know about 1940, and we know about that tradition carrying forward. But the Soviet Union, of course, was a fairly formidable machinery, not only military, but in terms of political engagement, political involvement, subversion, things of that sort. And so there must have been some sense during this period that there were positive observable results from neutrality. There also must have been some sparring over flights, internal organizations and so forth, and a sense that these things could be contained. So could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, about the sense in which deterrence is something that you could apply to this.
What's their feeling that this contributed to some deterrent in terms of more aggressive?
Yeah. Yes, there was. Yeah, I mean, certainly if you look at it from the national perspective of Finland as a country, as a nation state, yes, definitely. At the end of the war, Finland had been defeated, had fought against Soviet Union twice, had fought once as an ally of Germany, had participated in the siege of Leningrad, although not as much as it could have done even more brutal there, but still, it was in a very bad situation next to a superpower that was stronger than ever. So I think the whole deterrence in the sense of deterring the Soviets from doing something worse, something more vis-a-vis Finland was very much there, and was kind of the motivating force really, that you need to come to terms with the Soviets, that I was sort of alluding to here. Respect their interests, such as they define it in a political military interest, but not allowing them to come to exert too much ideological influence in Finland, or try to make Finland into a Soviet satellite state. And that, I think that thinking, that kind of goal was there all along, and it certainly was motivating, probably the key motivating factor for Kekkonen. Kekkonen came from, he was not a communist or even a socialist, but a kind of moderately centrist, even somewhat right-wing politician in his youth, which probably gave him, more credibility in this domestically, in this kind of liaising with the Soviets than someone with a more left-wing background would have had. And in his thinking, it was certainly very central to try to avert crises, try to avert situations in which the Soviet Union, for instance, want to activate the parts of the 1948 agreement, which called for consultations or Soviet assistance. And this happened on a couple of occasions when Finland had to assure them that things were okay and they didn't need to worry. So yeah, it's definitely there. And I think Kekkonen also, particularly by the 1970s, and this is kind of the reverse of the Finlandization as a critique of Finnish policies that I mentioned. Kekkonen kind of turned that around in some of his speeches and talked about Finlandization as a model that should be pursued, that it should be a model for other countries, because it gave a way of living peacefully side by side with the Soviets and avoiding conflicts and so on. So again, the idea was there in his justifications as well in public, but it was definitely there also behind the scenes when the Finnish leadership was thinking about what kind of policies they needed to pursue. Sorry, kind of a rambling answer, a very, very good question. Yeah.
Thank you. So let's see if we have anyone from the Zoom land wanting to join us. So any questions from?
Can I jump in?
Yeah, definitely do it, Mark.
Okay. Thank you, Pertti. That was very, very interesting indeed. I'd like to come back to your point about history and perhaps, there not being particular historical lessons. I was quite struck by the fact that you were talking of, and I quote, a hasty reversal driven by events. I'm not an expert on Finland, obviously, but I was wondering if there wasn't what you might describe as ethical Western dimension to this. That Finland has, as you rightly said, become part of the West via EU membership ever since the end of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the communism in Eastern Europe. And is there a sense that neutralism was a policy that in ethical terms, neutralism has a problem, doesn't it? Sweden during World War II was neutral between Nazi Germany and the democracies, or the imperial democracies, let's be more honest. You're sitting on the fence, you can argue that. And there's a sense that the new Finland, the Finland which in a sense has been liberated to be part of the West, it was really quite difficult to maintain any kind of continued neutralism, and that maybe the invasion by Russia of Ukraine, which is such an egregious act of unethical behavior in international terms, kind of tipped the balance, and so that therefore there was a sort of historical driving force, question mark.
Yeah. So kind of Western ethical standards as a driving force, as a historical lesson. Sorry, I'll write that down before I forget. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that was certainly there as an element. It was very, very strongly an element in public discussion of what had happened, the kind of moral and ethical outrage about Putin, and that then kept growing during the spring, and indeed has kept growing since, given everything that has happened. But I'm not really sure that was. Yes, I think it was there. But it's just my kind of feeling is that it wasn't really the thing, that it was more kind of realpolitik kind of stuff that was more in the front. I mean, yes, certainly the Finnish leadership was very vocal in condemning what had happened, and I'm no doubt that they meant every word of it and still do. And that these kinds of ethical considerations and Western standards are there in the background and certainly had an influence on things, but I wouldn't kind of put them at the forefront.
No, if I can just jump back in there. I mean, that was the point. You know, when I read Mate and Ante's article, as you rightly said in the quotation that came out, this idea of liquid neutrality, it gives a sense of a country that's striving for security and national interest reasons for a role of its own. And I honestly don't, obviously I've got no contribution to make which is right, which is wrong, but it did strike me that there might be a psychological dimension of throwing off the shackles of the past, so to speak.
Yeah. I mean, I think I need to think about that some more. I think you're right that there is that dimension. Just kind of how much weight to give to it is something that I need to kind of think about in my mind. I mean, one of the arguments again about the Finlandization period is that these kind of ethical standards were not much in evidence in Finnish behavior then. Finland typically did not condemn Soviet actions. It did not condemn the 56 Hungarian uprising or the 68 Czechoslovak intervention. It didn't praise them either, but it wasn't out there giving kind of moral condemnation. And there were other kind of issues in the 1970s. Solzhenitsyn's writings were not translated into Finnish. Whether it was probably not due to direct Soviet pressure, but more kind of self-censorship and unwillingness to do anything that the Soviets might have disapproved of. So at that time, I'd say that kind of ethical dimension, that's actually something that Ante and I are sort of working on a little bit, whether it was too much eclipsed at the time and pushed to the side. But then it comes to the fore more certainly after the Cold War. And that's actually, yeah, to look at the kind of evolution and changes in that would be a very interesting. Yeah, thank you. That's actually something I should look into. We should look into. Thanks.
I did actually have a follow-up about a more contemporary question, which was just simply on defense policy. 1,300 kilometer long border. Finland is already actually quite a militarized state, it seems to me. An awful lot of people have to do military training and so forth. It always struck me, every time I've been to Finland, it struck me how many people you see in uniform. Is there a sense that becoming part of NATO and, in a sense, being exposed again will lead to an intensification of the need for national security?
Yeah, I mean, that's again a good question and something that's been there in the discussions that have taken place. I mean, during the Cold War and still Finnish defense, well, during the Cold War, the point about Finnish defense policy was that Finland kept insisting that it has the capability to resist any attack, that it had to have a strong military force of its own, and has had throughout this period and still continues to have universal military service for men. So you have to, well, there's alternatives if you don't want to serve in the military, but basically you do have to serve in some way. And it's now also women can also serve on a volunteer basis. That's a fairly new development, but it's also part of the policy. So yeah, you certainly see a lot of young men in uniform. They're people coming back to weekend holidays from doing their service, because if you wear the uniform, you get to travel, I think, still for free on the train system. I think that's still the case, or at least to a limited number of free trips. Sorry, I think I may have lost my train of thought a little bit, but yeah, the one of the kind of points of debate or discussion now has been, what exactly will this mean? Will there suddenly be lots of NATO bases? Will Lapland turn into some kind of American training zone, and massive airfields and tanks everywhere, and so on? And one of the kind of, the defense minister, for instance, has been talking about how at the moment there's no plan for the establishment of permanent NATO bases of anything of that kind. So that's kind of a sensitive topic, because that the sort of independent defense, the universal military service, the Finnish military, relying on its own muscle, has been such a kind of long-standing thing, trope, whatever. And now it's a little bit unclear just how that will fit into the NATO scheme, and well, I mean, if Finland and Sweden even get accepted into NATO, that's not necessarily a done deal. Who knows? But it's certainly something that is out there in public discussion.
So, any other questions from the audience? Yes, please, in the back.
A question of a bit of a different nature. Since the end of the Cold War and the creation of an independent Estonia, has the bilateral political relationship formed some of the threat perceptions or adapted some of the threat perceptions in Finland, or even just the cultural people-to-people connections, in the way that there's a long historical Swedish effect on the political culture in Finland? What is I see, in the news, Prime Minister Marin with Prime Minister Kallas constantly side by side. So I was wondering if you could comment on how that might have shaped Finland's decisions to join NATO and their process to get there.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting question. Finland and Estonia. The Estonian language, of course, is the only other relatively major language that is fairly closely related to Finnish. So that's the only place where you can go as a Finnish speaker and speak Finnish and think that someone's going to understand you. And they often do. So there's a kind of cultural connection and linguistic connection. However, I guess the kind of Sweden has been a sort of big brother that Finland has looked up to, them sort of always a bit more advanced, a bit more sexy, or whatever, a bit more out there as in whatever field and successful. Finland and Estonia, I mean, partly because of the Soviet period and everything, a more, I guess, sort of restrained, in some ways difficult kind of relationship, perhaps. And as I mentioned here, particularly in the 2000s, when Estonia, but also Latvia and Lithuania were quite vocal about their fears about Russia. And once they became NATO members, 2004, I guess it was, that was, very much seen as a good thing there and as a necessity for any kind of defense needs. The Finnish leadership, particularly President Ahonen, was not very sympathetic to that at all, often. Gave a number of statements that Estonians in particular found offensive even, or certainly not very sensitive. In fact, she just a few weeks ago, she said something about Estonia having long experience of being in a kind of defense pact or something with the Soviet Union, which of course the Estonians immediately correctly pointed out as being completely false thing to say. It was not a defense pact. But then that's changed now in the last few years. Certainly this year, Estonia and Finland, it seems like the two prime ministers seem to have a close personal rapport. They seem to get along very well on a personal level, it would seem. And I think the relationship there has changed quite strongly. But that's been a more recent development. For most of the period since Finland and since Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania regained their independence, Finland's been a bit distant, and I think kind of kind of, as I was sort of implying, often adapted this attitude of we know better and you're a bit overly sensitive because of your recent history. So
Any other questions here on Zoom land? Well, if not, then please join me in thanking Professor Ahonen for a wonderful talk.
thank you.
And the speaker series is to be continued, but next time, hopefully with Mark in presence and not on the screen.
Thank you, Eugene. And thank you, Pertti, too. That was great.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. How do I turn this thing off? One of these buttons.